This is the Gold Newsletter Podcast, your home for investment, economics, and geopolitics. For our publications and archives, go to goldnewsletter.com. This is the Gold Newsletter Podcast. Fergus Hodgson, your host. Thank you for joining us. And we are going to be examining a topic that is a challenge for me and for many people to get their head around. It is the future of Bitcoin, this blockchain size challenge, and this fork prospect, which, at least in the case of Bitcoin Cash, is supposed to go ahead tomorrow. And so there's a lot to discuss here. I brought two guests on because this is such a technical topic. It took me a while to find the right people. But we have, on the one hand, we've got Jimmy Song. He is in Austin, Texas. He's a Bitcoin developer and entrepreneur and a consultant and advisor associated with Paxos and Itbit. And then I also have Pierre Rochard, and he is a software engineer in New York City, specializing in financial applications. When he isn't coding or tweeting, he enjoys mountain biking and weightlifting. Man, this is like a singles discussion.
I'm married.
Okay, very good. He graduated from the University of Texas at Austin with a Bachelor of Business Administration and a Master in Professional Accounting. And we will put both of their Twitter handles on the archives, just goldnewsletter.com/podcast. What a privilege to have you. Thanks for joining the show.
Thank you.
Thanks, Fergus.
On my left, I've got Jimmy. You've been writing a lot about this Segway prospect. Why don't you just explain the context, because things are starting to heat up. Your pinned tweet says that you did not expect it to be a fork or a Segway. So one of your predictions has been incorrect, although the other ones were correct. Why? What has changed?
So I think UASF BIP 148 changed everything, and are your viewers familiar with UASF?
No, let's try and make it for the general audience. What is UASF?
Yes, UASF stands for User Activated Soft Fork, and this was something that a pseudonymous developer named Shaolin Fry introduced to the Bitcoin dev list back in March. And basically, the idea behind the user-activated soft fork is that every person is master of their own node, right? Like you run Bitcoin software, you can run whatever software you want, you can accept or reject whatever blocks or transactions that you want. And this has been true for Bitcoin forever. What is different about UASF is sort of that you can sort of be master of your own node, and you can reject and accept blocks or transactions that you want, but it's not very useful unless you agree with others. That's the idea of a blockchain, is that you need to sort of share that state with others before it's actually useful. And what Shaolin Fry said on the Bitcoin devs mailing list was, okay, well, all these miners are not accepting SegWit. So here's what we can do. We can make it so that they will accept it, and through that we can get some mining power, and because it's a soft fork, we can eventually take over. And that got more and more traction, and at a certain point there was sort of a August 1st date set for a Flag Day user activated soft fork that would basically force everyone to signal for SegWit BIP 141. And because of that, Bitmain sort of responded, and they said they would do a hard fork, and they were very concerned. The New York agreement came about around Consensus 2017, which was back in May, which was also sort of a response to BIP 148 due August 1st. And what ended up happening is that the New York agreement created a new Bitcoin repository, BTC1, or SegWit2x, or New York Agreement. They're all essentially the same thing, and that sort of front ran the user activated soft fork by getting 80% of miners to agree that they would signal for SegWit, and that's essentially what ended up happening. BIP 91, that was sort of the way to get SegWit, activated about a week and a half ago, and that's sort of where we've been but then Bitcoin Cash came.
Yeah, I mean, I fear that is too technical. So Pierre, one thing is with the problem is that people in the Bitcoin realm, they're so embedded in this vocabulary that most people do not understand. Yeah. So Pierre, you have a crack, man.
Yeah, so I think Jimmy gave an excellent synopsis of today's state of play. I think that to understand how we got here will provide the audience more context on what SegWit is and what the block size limit is. So when we think about Bitcoin, every 10 minutes approximately, because it's kind of a statistical average, a new block is created that has transactions in it that the Bitcoin payment system is settling. And I'm trying to use non-technical terms, and I may be oversimplifying, but that's the gist of it. A long time ago, Jimmy might know the exact date, but Satoshi, the original developer of Bitcoin, correct me if I'm mistaken, added a limit to the size of the blocks. And the idea at the time was that he wants to avoid the risk of having a spammer come on the network and cause a denial of service to the network, where people would no longer be able to send quote-unquote legitimate transactions, and instead the blocks each 10 minutes would be filled with spam, and it would undermine the Bitcoin's ability to grow and to have more user adoption. So at the time, it was uncontroversial because the limit was 1 megabyte every 10 minutes, and the amount of legitimate transactions was far below that. And so it was kind of more of a hypothetical limit. And it just ended up never getting removed. And we started hitting it last year in earnest. And what happened when we started reaching this limit is that we started having competition to get into the blocks. And this competition has been driving up transaction fees. So currently it can cost, to send, I recently checked.
Yeah, but just slow down there, because I understand, yep. And the predicament is that there are, like, as two sides to Bitcoin. There are people who actually work in it professionally, and then there are just straight users. And I don't understand how people compete for space in the blockchain. I mean, when you say there are transaction fees, how does that impact your capacity to enter the blockchain?
So a transaction has a certain size to it. Like, so if you think about a file size, it's got a certain number of bytes to it. And if there's only 1 megabyte of space, and you've got thousands and thousands of transactions trying to fit themselves into that 1 megabyte, it's ultimately, I think it's the miners who choose what transactions are going to go in there. And so if they're being rational, which for the most part they are going to choose the highest paying transactions to fit them in. Is that
I understand.
Clear?
Right, so there are maybe gatekeepers to some degree who will facilitate the process for a higher rate.
Oh, well, I should add. So miners get paid with the creation of new Bitcoins, which is constantly decreasing because ultimately it's kind of an asymptotic curve to 21 million Bitcoins. Currently, every 10 minutes, it's 12.5, correct, Jimmy?
Mm-hmm.
12.5 Bitcoins. And so the transaction fees are on top of that. And in Satoshi's white paper, he said, well, when there's no block reward possible anymore because we've reached the cap, then it's possible that transaction fees would compensate miners. And I want to link
but
this.
But slow down, what would you be mining if we've already hit the max, basically?
Well, so you're actually, when you're mining, you're not really mining for the block reward. The block reward is kind of a lottery system where, because you're mining for to clear transactions, you're going to randomly receive a block reward and the associated fees with that block. It's a little hairy to explain.
Well, can I try explaining it?
Go ahead, Matty.
Think of a block as sort of like a box of checks, right? And what a miner does is they decide which checks go into that box, okay? And that's the entirety of the block. And so these checks sort of give something of a kickback to the miner. It's like 50 cents or $1 or $2, depending on how urgent that transaction was. If you have more checks than fit into the box, well, then whoever kicks back the miner more money is going to get into that box. That's what a rational miner would do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand. The predicament is that many people who are users of Bitcoin, they don't understand how can there be this cap on the number of transactions. And of course, the hope was that Bitcoin use would grow, and it has, of course, not necessarily in a steady fashion. It's grown over the last few years, fine, but we've come up against this capacity challenge. Now, I think maybe we can get lost in trying to explain the back end. Let's try and get a handle on, one, what exactly is happening, right? So what is happening from the user perspective, and two, does this signal some sort of instability or challenge to Bitcoin as the natural monopoly of cryptocurrencies?
So I think for the users, the pain point, and this has been communicated by Bitcoin businesses, is that transactions are taking longer and longer to clear, and they're becoming increasingly expensive. And this is a poor user experience from a historical perspective, because historically transactions have been very inexpensive. It might cost a nickel to send what now costs $2, and it might take 8 hours for what used to take 10 minutes. So this has been a source of frustration from a user perspective. And what was the second half?
No, okay, well, that's fine. No, it is a source of frustration because the assumption was that this digital currency or cryptocurrency would be instant, basically ideal or perfect from the user perspective. And now, I'm a user of Bitcoin. Now we do not understand what is happening. So what is the future of this currency? Because, of course, there are all sorts of cryptocurrencies now. There's a big array which are trying to, not necessarily trying, but are gradually chipping away at the dominance of Bitcoin. And my concern is what is going to happen after tomorrow. Does this signal that Bitcoin's maybe dominance is coming to an end?
So that's a big question. I think that the reason Bitcoin is having a scaling problem, quote unquote, is because it is the dominant player, and any other cryptocurrency that gains momentum is quickly going to hit the same issues, and it's quickly going to encounter, and some are going to have worse issues from a scaling perspective. But you're going to encounter a trade-off between your throughput, the number of transactions you're able to send through what we would call layer one, which is the Bitcoin network itself, and what, vaguely speaking, is decentralization. So who is able to run a Bitcoin full node, which is that this node receives all of the blocks, so that's 1 megabyte every 10 minutes. And if we increase that to 10 megabytes or a gigabyte every 10 minutes, you're just mathematically, you're going to decrease the number of nodes that are running on the network, because it will become increasingly expensive to do so. And philosophically, the fewer nodes you have, the less sovereignty you have over your money.
Well, not only that, but it's very hard to transfer that amount of data to nodes all over the world very quickly. You only have about 10 minutes. And it's very difficult to transmit a gigabyte.
But to go back to whether Bitcoin will continue to be the dominant cryptocurrency, I think that this goes into what are Bitcoin's options today for scaling. So the brute force approach is to outright increase the block size limit. And there have been historically several proposals to do so. This requires what's called a hard fork. And currently, on August 1st, tomorrow, the one that seems to have some momentum, I don't know how to quantify it, but it seems to be a minority, but a
significant
minority. They are doing Bitcoin
yes.
Cash.
Yes.
And they want to increase the block size limit to 8 megabytes. And then the other proposal is a SegWit, which is essentially, what if we can leave some data out of blocks so that we can free up space, and that way we don't have to increase the block size limit itself. And then there's a compromise between the two, which is why not both? And that's what SegWit 2x is, which is let's increase the block size limit to 2 megabytes and also implement SegWit, we could call it like compression or like a optimization.
But even if we have 2 megabytes, presumably we'll just hit that sooner rather than later. I mean, that doesn't seem like a long way off.
Well, I mean, I think that it depends on the usage patterns on the network. So, for example, when a user sends Bitcoins to another user and they're both on Coinbase and they're sending it directly to each other, that never hits the blockchain. So that's kind of a different layer to the system, and we wouldn't. Yes.
Right. I understand that there are basically ways to transfer Bitcoin between users without going on the blockchain, like basically to almost like sublet the use of the coins through. And your example is Coinbase, which I use as well. It's the most prominent one in the United States. And why has that alternative not been more popular? Do you want to take this one, Jimmy?
Well, I think it has. I've heard stats from someone like Zappo, for example. They do more off-chain transactions than on-chain transactions, and it's hit that 1 megabyte limit despite sort of all these optimizations that a lot of these companies have done. I mean, there's sort of more company-to-company things that you can do. So, for example, if Coinbase and Purse if a user were transferring money from Coinbase to Purse, before they were sending out transactions on the Bitcoin blockchain, what ended up happening later is that Purse has an account on Coinbase, and whenever a user sends money from Coinbase to Purse, what Coinbase does is they debit Purse's account, credit their own account, and lets Purse know, and then Purse will just credit that account. So it never hits the blockchain.
Right. It's basically they just change the balance maybe at the end of each day or whenever. They don't have to transfer. Right.
Right. And all sorts of things like that have been happening on the network, and I think that's why you sometimes see fees going lower.
On top of that, so that's kind of one version of a second layer. There have been other proposals, such as what's called the Lightning Network. I'm not as familiar with it as Jimmy might be.
Right. Lightning Network essentially codifies that and lets you do that on-chain as well. So instead of like Coinbase and Purse do thousands of transactions a day, you can sort of compress that into a single transaction on the blockchain and have it so that you can't really cheat or carry any custodial risk on the other side. So if Coinbase goes bankrupt, Purse might be out Bitcoins that they had on the account at Coinbase, but with something like a Lightning Network, they wouldn't be. They would always be in possession of their coins, but still only have one transaction per day or something like that.
I want to tie this back to the core question of Bitcoin's dominance and its competitiveness versus other cryptocurrencies, which is that from what we discussed about the different scaling options, I think that Bitcoin will continue to be able to scale. I think that the big open question is whether the animosity and politics of what the trade-off should be and what the solution should be will cause a splintering within the Bitcoin community, where they will separate into two different or multiple different currencies, each currency having its own scaling philosophy. And that's kind of a worst case scenario. And it would divide the value.
Why is that such a bad thing if we have basically different forms of Bitcoin running around?
Well, it's inflationary in a sense, right? Because you're multiplying the money supply every time. And granted, it's I say inflationary very loosely because these would be different currencies. It wouldn't be new Bitcoins. It would be essentially altcoins, right, that use the same history from a certain point in time. And I think that scenario is fairly unlikely just from a network economics point of view. I don't think that alternative versions of the Bitcoin network are likely to survive for very long. They probably mean revert into merging back together in some sense.
This episode is sponsored by the New Orleans Investment Conference and Gold Newsletter. For over 40 years, investors have relied on both of these institutions to get timely intelligence from the world's top experts and to discover tomorrow's biggest winners in metals and mining. Visit NewOrleansConference.com and GoldNewsletter.com to learn more.
Yeah, well, let me transfer that thought off to Jimmy. Do you think the Bitcoin Cash has a lifespan? What will happen to this new proposal, this new sort of soft fork?
Well, it's a hard fork.
It is a hard fork?
Yes. Bitcoin Cash is a hard fork.
I thought that required a consensus for a hard fork.
Right. So that's why it's splitting off. So basically the difference between a soft fork and a hard fork is that a soft fork is backwards compatible. So nodes that don't upgrade still are on the same chain. In a hard fork, everyone has to upgrade or else you sort of
you're lost
into your own.
Yeah.
So in many ways, I think like what Pierre was implying, Bitcoin Cash is a lot like a new altcoin with an airdrop that's equivalent to whatever the Bitcoin ledger is at 12:20 on August 1st UTC, something like that. And that's one way to look at it and maybe a way to see it. But to get back to your question of why is this bad? Why is this splintering bad? Well, there's several reasons. One of which is you have a lot of brand confusion. You know, what is Bitcoin? Well, there's like 7 different Bitcoins. Well, it's kind of hard to describe. Another is that the quality of the development and sort of the bleed over of like bugs in one versus the other and features in one. That's very confusing. But finally, the biggest concern in my mind is like a lot of the infrastructure that's been built for Bitcoin has to change to accommodate all of these other things. So every exchange is right now scrambling because they have to accommodate for Bitcoin Cash. They don't have the infrastructure.
Yeah, well, for example, Coinbase has simply alerted customers that they're not going to have anything to do with Bitcoin Cash, at least not now. If you want to move to Bitcoin Cash, you need to get off Coinbase because we're not going to be upgrading or handling it. Maybe they will in the future. Maybe they'll integrate it like they have with Ethereum. But so there is already that confusion that people who are on Coinbase, I suspect, are saying, I don't know what to do. I'm kind of confused because I'm not a specialist in this topic. This is my concern too, that I really want to draw your wisdom for users. How should people who hold and use Bitcoin but are not professionals in the field, how should they respond to this?
Well, first of all, you should get your coins off of Coinbase, right? Like, or any exchange for that matter. And this is not just for this particular event, but you should be controlling your private keys. Now, you could go get a Trezor, you could get a Ledger, you can go use Armor, you can use, a bunch of wallets. But essentially, as long as you control your private keys, you own everything that is associated with that private key. And with something like Bitcoin Cash, your private key will work on both chains, both in Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash, which is why I've been recommending to people, go get your coins off of these exchanges. And that's something that you definitely should do. I know, for example, at ItBit, one of the things that we're coming up against is that we don't have the infrastructure to support this. So we will make our customers whole eventually with Bitcoin Cash. It's just that it's going to take a while before we can develop something where you can get it out quickly. And everyone's kind of expecting Bitcoin Cash to be pretty volatile, whether or not a lot of people just dump a lot on the market, or there's people that are buying it up because they think it's a new thing or whatever. If you have control, then you can go. If you own your own private keys, you can go and sell it whenever you want. But if you have it at an exchange, you don't know when you're going to get your Bitcoin Cash.
Right. Yeah. Well, so okay, get a private key or get off these exchanges, which I hate to say it, these exchanges are just more appealing to non-specialists because it just seems more like what they know. Like someone else is handling this and I just worked with them. It's somewhat of a delegation of responsibility maybe, but that's I mean, Coinbase is it's been like 4 million users. It's really incredible how they've picked up so many people. So Pierre, what do you want to augment or add to that?
Yeah, sure. I think that Jimmy listed some really good wallets. I think that if you're not super confident, there are kind of in-betweens in the sense of if you go with blockchain.info's wallet, you still control your keys. If you use a mobile wallet like Green Address or Bread Wallet, you have a lot of the convenience, I find, of having a mobile wallet with a lot of security. Cell phones today, especially, I'm most familiar with an iPhone, but I'm sure it's the same for Android. They've put a lot of emphasis in making these devices very secure. And so as long as you back up your keys, or they often have just a series of random words that you can write down, then you can have a lot of the convenience and a lot of the sovereignty over your money that comes along with having your private keys.
Okay, guys. Yeah, we're pushing the half hour. Any final remarks before I let you go? Anything we've missed, or you think that we should have covered?
Well, first of all, don't panic.
I was going to say the same.
Bitcoin's lasted almost 9 years already, and it's done fine. As long as you hold private keys, you believe in sound money. Those are the big things, and it'll do okay. This too shall pass. So, the next few days will be pretty volatile, I think, and there will be a lot of rhetoric coming out of both sides. But hold. And, if you're a long-term investor, you should be okay.
And I would add that, people can be irrational and emotional and outrageous, but on the whole, I think that their self-interest will prevail and will have an outcome that is satisfactory to all parties.
Both of these guys are active on Twitter. Jimmy Song has an archive on Medium. It's just medium.com @JimmySong. So I'll share again those notes on the podcast archive. This is obviously a topic that requires ongoing reading or investigation. There's so much going on in this space, so it motivates me to, I guess, devote more time than I already am to this topic. For better or worse, I still believe in the idea of alternative currencies. I think it's a wonderful prospect. So I hope just like you do that these are just minor bumps in the road towards growing adoption of the currencies. So thanks guys for your time, and I look forward to being in touch. All right.
Thanks, Fergus.
Cheers.
Thank you.